Hello, listeners. Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
So before we get started, Caryn, why don't you just tell me a bit about yourself and tell me how you got connected with this case, because I understand you've been there since the beginning.
Right. So I'm a digital broadcast journalist for Global News based in Toronto, and I do cover a great deal of crime. And I remember that there was this evening back in 2017, it was November, and that I had seen a post on Facebook. And much like many of our stories, it started with this basic post about a missing girl. And I hadn't heard about her disappearance by police, and it just sort of stood out to me. And I remember flagging it to our assignment desk, and then lo and behold, a short time later, it might have even been the next day, Toronto police sent out this news release about a missing girl named Tess Richey. She was 22 years old. She'd been reported missing in the Church and Wellesley area, and that in Toronto is the gay village. And I was working a morning shift. I was reporting on her disappearance when an update came a few days later that she'd been found. It was not a suspicious death. And then suddenly another update after that indicating, in fact, it was a homicide. The cause of death was neck compression. And it's sort of all stemmed from there. And I feel like over the years, I've stuck with this story, and I've gotten to know the family as a result of that. And I can tell you that this is a really remarkable family that's just been through any parent's worst nightmare. And then, of course, I was there through the course of the trial as well.
Mm-hmm. And now, so it started for you with basically just catching wind of a Facebook post, and you started following it. Here we are now, nearly 4 years later, and you're just now, I guess, seeing the end result of basically the entire story playing out. So let's go through some of it. But before we get too deep into what actually happened, I know through your reporting, just as you said, you had a lot of contact with the family and got to learn a lot about them and about Tess. So why don't you tell me a bit about her? Who is Tess Richey, and what did you learn about her life and her personality?
So when Tess had initially disappeared, Global News had interviewed two of her sisters, Rachel and Jenna. They were worried sick about Tess. We learned that she was the youngest of 5 girls, that she had gone out to party, and that she had never returned. We learned quickly that it was this close-knit group of sisters, typical, gang of sisters who always had a phone chat going. And it wasn't like Tess to just vanish, that a sister would always know where the other sister was. And so at the time, we also had been reporting about other men specifically, who had been going missing from that same part of the city, the village. And so Tess's case became pretty high profile. But she didn't fit the profile of the other disappearances, which were specific to gay men, I should say. Tess was just this young girl from North Bay, Ontario, had been living in Toronto, again, a close-knit family of girls, and one day she's missing. She's gone.
You mentioned she was from North Bay, Ontario, which I understand is outside of the city. What brought her to living in Toronto? What was she actually doing living in Toronto?
Right, so she'd been living in Toronto for some time. She came here for school. She attended Seneca College. A couple of her sisters were here as well. This is a girl who, by all accounts, was full of life. I mean, you can even just see it when you look at her pictures, just a bubbly, petite brunette. She dreamed of becoming a flight attendant. She wanted to travel the world. She was also an aunt, again, had all these sisters, and just a lot of friends. And I noticed that throughout the trial, many of them would come to the court. Many of them have always, remained vocal on social media for years about the need to get justice for Tess. And they've always spoken so highly of her, really from the very beginning. Again, just this lovely girl, a lot of energy, so much promise. And in fact, she was just days away from her 23rd birthday when this all happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, it all seemed to happen the night of November 25th, 2017. You had already mentioned she was went out on the town that night, downtown Toronto, to party. Can you tell me a bit about what was known about her activities that night? What was she actually out doing, and who was she with?
So she had spent the day with her sister Rachel, who would, by the way, go on to testify in a very painful testimony during the trial. So we learned that Tess had suffered a bad breakup. It wasn't her first one. In fact, there was video on YouTube of a previous breakup, a very emotional Tess talking about it. But this one, again, took a toll on her emotionally. She was 22 years old, and like any other girl who had just been, had suffered this split, she wanted to go out, wanted to have a fun night on the town. She did keep in touch with Rachel at first when she got to the club. The club she went to, by the way, is a popular drag bar. Again, that's in the village in Toronto. It's called Cruise and Tangos on Church Street. She went alone, but she had plans to hook up with a friend of hers from North Bay, in fact, named Riley, which she did. And she had some drinks at the club, was dancing. And I'll note that much of the time in the club is actually captured on surveillance video. So, in fact, there's even a moment where we see her crossing paths with the man who would turn out to be her killer. That, too, is captured on video. But the two never spoke, didn't know each other. They, in fact, met later on after last call. So really just a night out. She went out to party. She had some drinks. She had a good time.
And the trouble, and really this story happens after last call when she leaves the bar. What trail basically did she leave from the point that she left the bar? Like, when she went missing, what did we know about her whereabouts and activities after the bar closed down?
So this all takes place over this short stretch of, a short distance in the village. She leaves the club, and I'll mention that what's so interesting about the times we live in, and especially the city of Toronto, is that so much of what we do is captured on camera. And really, right up until Tess's murder, we see her movements that night. All of it was shown in court during the trial. Tess left the club. Tess met Caryn Lieberman outside. Young man, met him outside. Short time later, she tries to hail a passing cab. He waves it off. We saw all this video in court. He said that the cab was holding up traffic, and that's why he had waved it off. We know that Tess was out walking with Caryn Lieberman, and that old friend Riley, who she'd met at the club. They went to a hot dog stand. Again, there's video of this. Then they made their way down the street. They started chatting with a woman who was outside. Riley decides she's leaving. She takes off, and Tess started to leave as well. She even ordered an Uber, and of course, as we know with Uber, everything's tracked. Now, the Uber driver did come, but she never showed up at the pickup spot, so he eventually leaves a couple minutes later, and then we know that Schlater followed Tess to where she was sitting. What we think is she was sitting and waiting for that Uber at the time, but a short while later, they end up walking down a stairwell, and 40 minutes later, there's video of Caryn Lieberman leaving, and Tess Richey's never seen alive again.
When Tess failed to return home, that night or the next day, it seemed that very quickly, like this story was circulating around as a missing persons case, that people were very concerned about her. What initially made it so suspicious or so concerning? Do you know why this kind of caught attention so fast?
So people were vanishing from the village. It was just, there was so much speculation at the time and fear that there was a serial killer at play. People were scared. We were telling stories about it all the time. People that were living in the village said they felt police were not protecting them. These, of course, are people who live in the gay village in Toronto. And in fact, they were right, because as we would later learn, there was a serial killer, and it was Bruce MacArthur. But Tess wasn't part of that. Still, her disappearance happened around the same time. And it wasn't taken seriously. That was the argument, because her sisters put out these posters. It was her sisters who searched for her friends as well. It was her mother who came from North Bay. And it was clear to the family that something was wrong. And many in the city were questioning whether police were taking it seriously enough. Not only her disappearance, but of course all those other men who had disappeared before her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I recall, I remember watching the news reports and seeing Tess's photo in the reports and whatnot of a missing young woman in Toronto, and it always, the articles would kind of end with explaining the area's history for missing people, and yeah, of course, that would take a pretty incredible turn with Bruce MacArthur's arrest.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Now, only days after Tess went missing, things really took a heart-wrenching turn. And you mentioned the fact that it was her sisters and her family looking for her. of course, the police were involved, and it was a major story already, before the point that she was found. But the way she was found really just added an incredible amount of cruelty to this whole situation. I know you were on the ground reporting when this happened. Tell me about what you learned and how you found out about how Tess was actually located.
Right. So again, police had been heavily criticized because, why had they not found Tess's body? And then, her body, we learned, had been lying just 40 meters from a location where officers were called to check a few days before. And it was alleged that a couple of officers hadn't canvassed the neighborhood properly, didn't talk to neighbors or search the property. And those officers were charged, by the way, with misconduct. And I know we'll get to that later. But it was, in fact, Tess's own mother with a friend of hers who found her body at the bottom of a stairwell. And it's worth mentioning that the murder actually helped launch a dedicated missing persons unit in Toronto because it just caused so much controversy and everyone was just so shocked. And I recall very vividly a news conference that Police Chief Mark Saunders had held. And I asked him point blank in that news conference, how could this happen? How could a mother discover her own daughter's body and not police officers? It really was so shocking at the time, and it was just gripping, in the city, in this country, and I think it still is, and it just sort of takes your breath away. As a mother, I couldn't even, it's unfathomable, really.
And again, she was found basically where she was last seen, so it's just
exactly
amazing that, and just so utterly tragic. But that's the way it turned out. And when Tess was located, I think initially the news circulated that she was found and she was deceased, but it was very quickly after that the news came out that it appeared that foul play was involved and that there was a person of interest that police wanted to speak with. I think actually the initial article I read about this person of interest that the police wanted to get in touch with, I think actually you may have wrote it or appeared in it in some capacity. So tell me a bit about how word got out that this wasn't just, a young woman falling downstairs or something and that someone else was likely involved.
So there were a number of news releases that came out in the days following Tess's disappearance. As I mentioned, first it was that she was missing. Then it was that she died, but there was nothing suspicious about the death. And then it was a homicide, and that the cause of death was neck compression. And so much about this story was really just unraveling over the course of, I would say, weeks. And then it was months until, of course, the arrest was made. It was shocking, really, and nobody really understood how could this have gone from a basic missing persons case to a murder. I remember that when police released the name of the suspect, we had gotten the Schlater's home address, and that I went to the home. I remember we spoke to some neighbors who all indicated it was a family of four, mother, father, and two sons. Kaylin was the older son. I remember it was unclear what the connection was between this murder victim and this man now accused of murder. I'll add that initially he was arrested for second-degree murder, and that was upgraded to first-degree. And I do recall it took a long time to finally arrest him. And when that happened, it was certainly, there was talk about relief on the streets. People felt relieved that, this alleged killer was off the streets. But there were still so many questions. And of course, as we mentioned a little bit, was also the fact that, where were Toronto police in all this?
Mm-hmm. And as a news reporter, did you know what connected him to Tess, like where he came from in connection to this crime? Did you have any idea?
No, I mean, we just knew that this was a guy that was out that night, and that, there was a photograph of him on Church Street, and so we had no idea. And I don't think we knew for quite a while that they didn't even know each other. I mean, they were about the same age, so I guess maybe people would have assumed at the time that maybe that there was some sort of relationship, but no one knew, and it was really, there was so much mystery in this case, and then of course many twists and turns.
Yeah, and one of those twists, even before this went to trial, was the family very publicly, I believe, pointed a finger at the police, as you mentioned earlier, alleging their mishandling of the case, and that was it was a lot more than just the family. Basically, Torontonians who are following this story had big concerns with how the police handled it. What exactly were the concerns that people had with the police? Like what was said that they did wrong or didn't do?
Absolutely. Well, we do know for a fact that 2 police officers were charged with misconduct. I mentioned earlier, so I'll get more into that. There was a police investigation because there was so much anger and resentment that, again, how could a mother find her daughter's body? How were police, it just, by all indications, police couldn't have taken it seriously enough if the mother was the one to find her daughter's body. So, again, a couple of police officers, 2 constables, both with 51 Division in Toronto, they were charged with 2 counts of misconduct for neglect of duty under the Province's Police Services Act. Now, both officers had gotten a radio call about 4 p.m. the day after Tess went missing. They were told, very basic information, check an address in relation to this missing person's case. And when they got to the scene, they found out that the spot was the last known location where she had been seen. But it's alleged they didn't search the adjoining property. They didn't look at the immediate area thoroughly, because honestly, I can't figure out how they wouldn't have seen her if they had, and that they didn't conduct a canvass of neighbors, and that obviously would have led to information. Also that they failed to notify a supervisory officer of whatever it is that they found or didn't find. And so there was a lot of anger and resentment about this, because I could tell you, having been to the location many times after Tess was found, it's almost impossible to figure out how an officer wouldn't have seen a body there, because it was so easy for Tess's mother and her friend to notice her laying there, because it's a building at the corner of a pretty popular street that was under construction. But then if you can picture, just next to that building, there's a stairwell that's not blocked off. You can walk right up to it. And just down the stairwell, if you just peer right over, was where Tess Richey's body was found.
Now, we'll start getting into the trial here. But first, just to kind of put it in perspective, so why don't you set the scene? Like, tell us what the feel in the courtroom was like leading into this trial. I can't imagine how emotional this must have been.
Very, very emotional case. Family of each, both the victim and the accused in the courtroom every day. So, Kaylin Schlater would sit in the prisoner box every day in his navy blue suit with his white shirt. His mom and dad would sit directly behind him. There was very little eye contact, if any at all. And for many of the court dates, his younger brother showed up as well. The parents had, I don't know if it's a relative or a close friend who came as well, a support person. And then a lot of observers, many observers, and these are just regular people who just were fascinated by this case, who were there probably more often than I was. Really until the verdict came down. And then on the other side, where the Crown was sitting, behind the Crown, was Tess Richey's family. Her mother, almost every single day. Her 4 sisters, nearly every single day, if not every day. The partner of one of her sisters. And a lot of Tess's friends came very frequently. And, keep in mind, this was, a 7-week trial. And you have to think about how people's lives get put on hold for such an extended period of time. But from day one when Tess went missing, and then right after when her body was found and it was deemed a homicide, her family and friends have fought tooth and nail for justice for her. And so it was important for them to be there. Although many times, I wouldn't say many, but there were times where they'd have to leave the courtroom because pictures or evidence was shown that it's just obviously too much to bear.
Mm-hmm. Now, first up in the trial would have been the prosecution presenting their version of what happened that night. Tell me about basically the Crown's idea of what happened between Kaylin and Tess, and what evidence did they use to support it?
So the Crown argued Kaylin Schlater was this predator who should be convicted of first-degree murder. The Crown had argued that he had sexually assaulted and strangled Tess before leaving her body at the bottom of that stairwell. The prosecutor, Bev Richards, she had said that this was a guy who stalked Tess, who isolated her by bringing her to this outdoor stairwell, that it was clear from video evidence she had no interest in him, but he had lured her away from the public into the alleyway, that she'd said no to him when he wanted sex, but that made him angry. The Crown also had an undercover cop testify who said Schlater told him, once he'd been arrested several months later, that he had said, I like a challenge, and that sometimes you have to push the boundaries with women. And so a ton of evidence. There was security footage. Prosecutors argued it was clear from what you could see that Tess, had no affection or interest in Schlater, that, she called an Uber just after 4 a.m. When he sat down with her, and I'm visualizing it, when he sat down with her on this concrete barrier following her friend's, departure when her friend left, that, they got up just before this Uber would arrive, and that he would escort her down to the stairwell. That there was, all kinds of video was shown throughout this trial. At 4:14, we see Tess Richey and Caryn Schlater walking toward that stairwell, and then there's nothing. And then 45 minutes later, video of Caryn Schlater calmly walking away. No sign of Tess Richey. Also, we heard from undercover cops, 2 of them, that the Crown had brought forward as witnesses. Schlater told them a lot of info that they relayed in court about how he had said he slept with over 40 women, about how, he was this, I guess, like a Prince Charming, if you will, that the girls found him charming. He told a lot of stories to them, and the undercover cops relayed that, as testimony. And court also heard from a jailhouse informant. So this was pretty interesting. The Crown had said, the Crown presented this person who his identity is concealed, and he was a former cellmate of Caryn Schlater. This is a guy with a long record. And so, you take it as you will, but this is a person who testified that he had no reason to lie about this because he, had nothing to gain, but that Schlater confessed to strangling Richey to him. So this is a guy who shared a jail cell with Caryn Schlater for 2 months, and that was what he said, that there was a confession made to him while they were in jail together.
Wow. In some of that, there was one particular piece of video that they showed of outside of the nightclub. And Caryn was just kind of like, there was like a crowd of people who had left the nightclub kind of milling about outside, and he seemed to just be kind of lingering, looking at people. Like, do you remember seeing that video? Like, that one really painted my opinion of like what he was up to that night.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So, this is, again, so much surveillance video. So this is a surveillance video, I believe it's off the club, and it shows it, it's a northbound view of Church Street. And you're looking at, what any club would look like after last call, a bunch of people kind of hanging out, right? Lingering, loitering. And he comes out and he is waiting so as we learned, he had a previous conversation with a woman who'd been at the club. And then when they left, she left with a man. And he's standing there for a while waiting and waiting and waiting. And as the Crown said, he was waiting because he was hoping to go home with that girl, that he was looking to have sex. He wanted to have sex that night, and he was going to find it wherever he could. But that girl ends up leaving, and so he's looking around, and then Tess Richey shows up. And the video shows him trailing behind Tess and her friend. And so, that was really, you're right, that is kind of a bit of a defining moment, if you will, in the video. And the video kind of sort of speaks for itself, in that this does look like, as the Crown presented, a man who was looking for something.
I understand the defense, and Caryn had a completely different version of the story. What was basically his defense? Like, how did his representation explain all this evidence against him, and and how it looks?
A much different picture. Mm-hmm. So the defense lawyers said that he was this easy target because he was, in fact, the last person seen with Tess Richey, based on all kinds of video. But he argued he was innocent. He pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. And the defense pointed the finger at another man entirely who is seen in the area that night. There is video that picks up this other person. And the defense suggested that he watched Tess and Schlater He watched them make out, and then he vaulted over a fence and a wooden gate to get into the alley where no one would see him, and that he was the one who committed the murder, that Kaylin Schlater was innocent. And that was really the defense in a nutshell.
And Kaylin's defense was basically that when he was with Tess in the stairwell making out, he had just left her there. He decided to walk away and left her alone, which just seems odd.
It does seem odd because, a man wouldn't leave a young man wouldn't leave a young woman in a dark alley. And he said, he'd asked her, should I stay? And she sort of waved him off, no, I'm fine. And then he claimed that she took out her cell phone and she was using her cell phone and she was distracted on that. And it's like, no, you can go, I'm done with you. In a dark alley at 4:00 in the morning. Really unusual for, a petite woman to do that. So yeah, a lot of it sort of didn't add up.
Were you in the courtroom because he did eventually take the stand in his defense? Right. Were you in the courtroom for any of these parts?
Absolutely.
Tell me about that. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. Tell me about him on the stand.
So, I was in the courtroom. The courtroom was packed that day. Obviously, the same people as usual, the same observers, his family, her family, and really there was not a seat to be had because it's just so unusual for defense to put forward, the accused. And so everyone was dying to hear his voice, just to hear from him. And so he did take the stand, and it was a very unusual start to hearing from him. The defense threw a bunch of questions at him, quick questions, and his answers were no. And in other, did you kill Tess Richey? Absolutely not. Did you sexually assault Tess Richey? Absolutely not. And that's kind of how it started, and then it slowed down. He, to me, did appear nervous. I found that he seemed very uncomfortable. There is a point in the day where he appeared to become emotional. I say appeared to because, I don't know. He looked to be. But he began his testimony by telling the jury that on that evening he had been drinking with some friends before heading to the club, that they ordered food, and that he went out to Cruise and Tangos, again, that's the club, and that after last call he ended up talking with Tess and her friend Riley outside the club. He had said, they seem like nice people, nice sociable people, so we hung out, and he said, a series of other details, and that a short while later it was Tess who asked him if it was okay if she kissed him. So he put it all on Tess Richey, that she was the one who made the moves. He also testified that they went down the stairs and, consensually began making out. He said he told her that he had some condoms, but she said she was on her period and that she couldn't have sex and that he was okay with that. But that's when he said he ejaculated in his pants and became embarrassed. And there, of course, was a lot of attention on that in his testimony by both the defense and the Crown. But he continued to maintain that that was embarrassing for him, and that, shortly after that, there was no reason to stay. So he offered Tess Richey to go back with him to his family's home because he still lived at home. But again, as I mentioned earlier, she declined, said, no, it's okay, I'm fine, you can go, and he left. Another thing that we heard from him was that, as I mentioned, that there were these undercover cops, right, who said that he had told them all kinds of stuff. So his argument in defense of that was that he had lied to the two men who he believed were criminals. Of course, he didn't know they were cops because they were undercover, and that the reason he had said all kinds of stuff, including that he'd slept with 40 women, was to protect the fact that he's bisexual. So he claimed that he was worried that that information would come out, and he didn't know how that would be taken, in jail, and so he had lied. But of course, so it was definitely a fascinating day. And that was his testimony, that Tess made the move.
Yeah, and it was like kind of the temperature in the trial was really ramping up at this point, and it was shortly after his time on the stand ended that the case almost got delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just the absolute worst timing, but the case managed to continue and play out. So what happened with that? What led to the case almost being stopped and then continuing?
So it's amazing, really, the timing of it all. I mean, this pandemic just, many people would say feels like it kind of came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it's become a pandemic so quickly, and so much has changed in just days. Well, this trial, obviously the wheels of justice grind slowly, and it took so long to get to trial. And then, of course, the trial lasted, up over 7 weeks, I believe it was. And then here we are in the final week, and we find out that, everything's being shut down in the city, of course, across the country. But everyone's waiting to find out what's going to happen with closing arguments. So it was, the Monday and the Tuesday that the Crown and the defense would give their closing arguments. And then a couple of days later, the judge was set to give his instructions to the jury, and then they would begin deliberations. Well, really, it was the night before the closing arguments that it seemed court was going to be shut down. And so there was a lot of questions. And I was in touch with Tess Richey's family, and they too were concerned, not because of COVID-19, but because, I'm sure that that's in the back of their minds. But for them, it's always been about justice for Tess. And how could they get so far only to have this put on hold? Well, remarkably, it was up to the trial judges in Ontario to decide in criminal cases whether they would continue and finish up a trial, especially if in this case it was really like the ending, right? And so the judge allowed this to continue, and I do know that there were a number of, what's the word? I guess there was unique circumstances put in place to abide by the advice of the experts, the social distancing, physical distancing, but the jury did deliberate for 3 days, and they were sequestered, and then they came up with their verdict.
Wow, and I could be wrong, but were not all the other cases that were playing out in Ontario frozen?
Absolutely. I'm fairly certain this was the only one in the province that continued to the very end.
Wow, that's amazing. It says a lot about the profile of the case and kind of recognizing what the family had been to up to this point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, as we just said there, the case did continue. The closing arguments were presented. Were there any surprises in the closing arguments, or was it very much similar to the opening arguments, basically just reinforcing their case?
Absolutely, just reinforcing their case, summing up what they'd seen. At this point, it's so many weeks of testimony and evidence, and so the Crown and the defense, they wrap up their arguments and put a bow, and then you hand it off to the jury, and everybody just waits. And the waiting is painful. It really is, and I'm sure it's excruciating for the family. And then just the stress of the COVID-19 pandemic, kind of everything all combined. I can't imagine what it was like. I know that the Richeys sat in court every single day, waiting and waiting and waiting till 7 o'clock at night, because that's when the deliberations would finish for the day. And then, as we mentioned, it was finally 2 hours before the end of what would have been the third day that they came in and said, we have a verdict, and everybody returned to court. You have 15 minutes to get there.
And I know you were a shut-in in your house, avoiding the pandemic, and weren't able to be there for the delivery of the verdict. That must have just killed you after following the story so long.
Absolutely. I mean, it's because it becomes more than just a case. You get to know people, and so the family became incredibly important to me. And whatever happened, I've always felt very strongly that this is an incredible family, and they're so strong and so courageous. And as I mentioned so many times, this is just a group of strong women who wanted justice for their youngest, and so it broke my heart not to be there for the day that they would really find justice for Tess.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people were surprised that, at least I know, I can speak for myself. I know I was surprised that the deliberations even took more than a day or two. But like you just said, I think it was a little over 3 days. So tell me about the verdict and what you learned, because I know there were Global had other reporters there. What did you learn about the delivery of the verdict and the reaction?
So the delivery was quick. It took a while to get everybody in place, just given the craziness and the surreal times that we're experiencing right now. But the verdict came back: first-degree murder. That comes with an automatic life sentence, no chance of parole for 25 years. So it really is, the justice that the Richeys were searching for, because that was what the Crown had been seeking. And so after that, it'll be sentencing, but again, it's pretty basic, because that's, first-degree murder. It comes with life. And we heard a little bit from the Richeys when they left the court, and it's relief, but it's emotional. I mean, it's, this is when the breakdowns happen. It's the exhaustion mixed with the, it's the exhaustion, the emotional fatigue of everything, and at the end of the day, the heartbreak doesn't go away, right? So so I think that's kind of what we heard. But of course, there was also mention that when the jury was read out and Caryn Slater was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, that a family member had yelled out "killer," which is not uncommon. We hear that a lot when a verdict comes down, and it's that release, right? It's that pent up anger and fear, and so much of it is fear because you just don't know. I mean, it's in the hands of 12 jurors, and in this case, they came back with a first-degree verdict.
Wow. Now, as someone who poured over the case to the point that you have, were you surprised at all about the decision, or was this what you were expecting as you watched this play out?
I feel like I never expect anything because you just really have no idea. Because it can always go either way. It can come back with a lesser, verdict. So I was happy for the family. The Crown had a very strong case, but as we mentioned, as much video as there was to show, the progression of that evening or early morning hours when Tess disappeared, that crucial piece of video showing what exactly happened, the murder, doesn't exist. And so there's always that fear, is the rest of it enough for a jury to convict? And in this case it was, because everything was just, the Crown's case was so strong.
Yeah, and as often seems to happen in a case like this, is just as the jury begins deliberations, inevitably there's like a news report that comes out about, what the jury didn't hear. And in this case in particular, some of the information that wasn't allowed to be presented to the jury against Caryn, to me at least, seemed really compelling. Can you tell me a bit about what wasn't presented in the courtroom that may speak to his motives, perhaps?
You're right. Hugely compelling evidence. The jury, for example, never heard about how Caryn Slater had this obsessive interest in violent pornography that did feature non-consensual sex, that he, enjoyed images of choking. The jury did not hear about the fact that he had an interest in choking with his previous partners, with other women. The judge had decided in pretrial that evidence would be excluded because of the probative value of the evidence, the probative value of the evidence was apparent in his words, and so it was excluded, and so the jury did not hear about it. And also, according to other court documents, so I was in court when that previous stuff was presented. I was not in court, but court documents suggested as well that on Slater's cell phone there had been Google searches that included searches for forced sexual acts, and that investigators had also found his phone had been used to access a particular video that was called Teen Forced and then Thrown Away Like Garbage. And that does depict a sexual assault of a young woman, including neck compression. And as we know, inevitably, Tess Richey did die of neck compression, and she was sexually assaulted and murdered that way. And so all of this was very compelling material, but no, none of it was presented in trial. But in the end, the jury still came back with that first-degree murder verdict.
Wow. Now, I'm sure the judge in the legal process has its reasoning, but as a layman myself, it just seems absurd that wouldn't be significant enough to warrant, inclusion in the prosecution's case against him. But I guess, fortunately, as you said, the jury had made the right decision without that. But for me, I think thinking, if putting myself in the shoes of the family, knowing that evidence and information is there but not presented, that must have just, I'm thinking while they're waiting for the deliberations, I'd be thinking about this, because to me it's almost not as compelling as the video evidence and whatnot, but it really just kind of paints a picture of why what appears to happen may have happened.
I totally agree, and I'm sure it does weigh on them and did weigh on them, and probably was very frightening for them. I guess at the end of the day, the judge had to make a call, and it had that was separate from the act of murder of Tess Richey. And so it was decided that, like any prior conviction, as an example, it would not be part of this particular case. But I'm sure it was a huge relief when, as we said a couple times, that, it didn't matter in the end, because the jury came back with its decision.
Yeah. Now, for you, having been with this case since the beginning and attending so much of the activity in the courtroom, was there one piece of evidence to you that really, like against Caryn, that really stood out to you as being, something that may have affected the jury's decision or affected the overall picture of his guilt?
It's such a tough question. I try to approach everything unbiased. Every person, as we know, is innocent until proven guilty. Certainly, the Crown had a very strong case. Again, the only missing piece was the video showing the murder. But at the end of the day, the jurors felt Caryn Slater was guilty. They believed it, and so he was convicted, and he will, of course, spend a lot of time behind bars. I felt that the video was hugely helpful, whatever we did see, in really painting the picture of the sequence of events that night. You do see Tess walking away from Caryn. You do see him following behind her. You do see this carefree existence of hers. And as we referred to earlier, him standing outside the bar kind of looking for something. So much of the Crown's case really was bolstered by all of this video. So I felt that the video helped portray the evening, but whether he was guilty or not guilty, at the end of the day, I think the jury made the right call.
Mm-hmm. And now, to wrap it up, I guess, like initially, Tess's disappearance really captured a lot of attention, both because she just comes across as very relatable, like the type of person that we all know. We've all been, in our young 20s going to a nightclub in, a city like Toronto. But after, so it's easy to understand why this story captured so much attention early on. But even throughout the trial, this became one of the biggest stories in Canada as this was playing out. Why do you think it is that Tess Richey and her story and this crime against her, why do you think it captured the attention it has overall?
Tess could have been anyone, any young woman out in the village that particular night, November 2017, could have been Tess Richey. She was this beautiful young woman, so many pictures of her. She was a stunning young girl, huge hopes for the future, this beautiful family of sisters, all close relationships, plenty of girlfriends, just this social butterfly. She was so young and she had so much promise. And, the fact that she just crossed paths with a man that night, who, as the Crown argued successfully, was out for sex, and she said no, it cost her her life. So really, it could have been anyone. She was the heart of her family, and the heart's broken. And, even though justice is served and a killer is behind bars, it doesn't matter, because for the Richeys, Tess isn't coming home. Nothing is going to bring her back. And also the fact that for a mother to find her own child's body, Tess's story is truly the unfathomable. I mean, nobody could imagine how it wasn't a police officer to locate Tess's body, that it was her mother. It's just so much about this story. It's gripping, and it really rips your heart out. And so at the end of the day, I feel relieved for this family that they found the justice that they've been seeking. And I hope that one day they're able to focus on, not the horrible way that she died, but the incredible life that she had and the amazing memories that her sisters often talk about.
I want to thank you for joining Caryn and I in this discussion surrounding the murder of Tess Richey. Like I've said many times in the past, I continue to be amazed by how much horror and heartbreak can be unleashed as a result of one person's senseless and thoughtless act. The world lost a special person in Tess Richey, and as far as why, it seems the only reason is one man's selfish quest to please his own morbid desires. In following Tess's story, it's apparent how much she's loved and how many people love her. The world undoubtedly is worse off without Tess in it. I only hope that the Canadian justice system allows Tess's loved ones to mourn her loss without fear that her killer will see freedom anytime soon. And with that, we'll end this episode of Nighttime. But before we part, I want to end with some thanks. First, a huge thank you to Caryn Lieberman for joining me on this episode. Caryn, I'm proud to have had you on the show. Your reporting on this story has been incredible. Tess is fortunate to have had you covering her story, and Global News is fortunate to have you covering it for them. In addition to Caryn, I'd like to thank the Canadian band Voxomnia for providing the music for this episode. And lastly, but most importantly, a huge thank you to the listeners of Nighttime. Without you, this show would have seen the light of day many moons ago. And with that said, if you want more Nighttime, let me recommend the premium feed. For about the price of a cup of coffee, you can access a separate feed where the episodes are posted earlier than in the free feed and are done so without any advertising. But beyond the regular episode, the premium feed also includes the Nightcap after-show episodes in which I and a guest climb a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. You can access the premium feed at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. And for anyone else out there who'd like to support the show but can't kick in financially, you can give me a big hand by simply telling your friends about me and leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or an equivalent. If any of you listening want to stay up to date with my activities on or off the show, follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I use the handle @NighttimePod. If you have any story ideas or want to give feedback on the show, I'd love to hear from you at nighttimepodcast@gmail.com. Now until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and stay safe out there.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.
We won. Tess got her justice. That's what I want to say. Tess got her justice. We'll never be happy. We'll never be complete again. But we can try to heal from here and do things in Tess's name. So thank you all for the support. It's been a rough road, but we made it. Thank you.